Some folks say loneliness is the hardest kind of prison, where the walls are built from years of silence and the bars are made of broken dreams. For 23 long years, Ezekiel Boone had served his sentence in the Colorado mountains, speaking only to the wind and finding comfort in the company of bears and mountain cats. When a rockslide destroyed his cabin in the spring of 1874, it seemed like just another cruel twist from a life that had already taken everything from him. But sometimes, when we think we've lost it all, that's exactly when life decides to give us something worth living for. In the dusty streets of Willow Flats, this broken man would meet a homeless woman named Clara, cast aside by the world, just like him. In a single afternoon that would change everything, he would offer her his name and his heart. But when desperate men learn about the gold hidden in Ezekiel's mountain refuge, would their newfound love be strong enough to survive the violent storm heading their way? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rubble, where Ezekiel Boone's cabin had stood for 23 years. Massive boulders, some as large as freight wagons, lay scattered like dice thrown by an angry god. His hand-carved walking stick, weathered smooth by decades of use and adorned with animal totems he'd whittled during endless winter nights, stood planted in the dirt beside him as he surveyed the devastation. The walking stick had been his first creation after settling in these high Colorado peaks. Each animal carved into its length told a story: the bear who'd shared his first winter, teaching him which caves stayed warm; the mountain cat, whose amber eyes had watched him from the rocks, showing him patience in hunting; the eagle, whose flight patterns had warned him of approaching storms. Now, as he gripped it with calloused hands, it seemed to pulse with memories of a life that had just ended in thunder and stone. Ezekiel had come to these mountains in 1851, a broken man of 32, running from a war that had taken his wife, his unborn child, and his faith in humanity. The Apache raids in Texas had left nothing but ashes where his small ranch once prospered. Sarah's grave marker, rough-hewn from oak, still stood somewhere in that burnt earth, but Ezekiel couldn't bear to see it again. The mountains had offered silence, solitude, and the kind of peace that only comes from accepting that some wounds never heal, they just become part of who you are. For over 2 decades, he'd built a life from nothing. His cabin had been snug and practical, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone fireplace that drew clean, and shelves lined with preserved meat, dried herbs, and the simple tools of survival. He'd learned to read weather in the behavior of chipmunks, to find water by watching how trees grew, to predict harsh winters by the thickness of squirrel coats. The mountains had been harsh teachers, but fair ones. They asked only that he respect their power and learn their lessons. His beard, now more silver than brown, reached nearly to his chest. His hair, pulled back with a strip of leather, showed the same weathered gray. Deep lines mapped his face furrows, earned from squinting into mountain sun and wind, from years of careful listening to the sounds that meant survival. His hands, broad and scarred, could set a trap in darkness, start a fire in rain, or carve beauty from wood with equal skill. The rockslide had come in the dark hours before dawn, preceded by the kind of deep mountain grumble that every creature understood as a warning. Ezekiel had rolled from his bed and rushed outside, just as the mountainside let go. 20 minutes of thunder and dust, and when it settled, his entire world lay buried beneath tons of granite and pine. Standing in the aftermath, breathing air still thick with rock dust, he faced a truth that cut deeper than the loss of his cabin. At 55, he could rebuild. His hands still held their strength, his mind its sharpness, but something inside him had shifted with those falling rocks. The perfect solitude he'd crafted was broken, and perhaps it was meant to be. His provisions were gone, crushed beneath boulders, his tools, his winter stores, his carefully maintained rifle all lost. What remained were the clothes on his back, his walking stick, and a small leather pouch containing a few gold nuggets he'd picked from streams over the years. Gold meant nothing in the high country, but down in the settlements, it might buy him a new start. The decision to descend felt like surrender, but also like awakening. For the first time in 23 years, Ezekiel Boone pointed his weathered boots downhill and began the journey toward other human beings. Willow Flats sprawled in the valley like a collection of children's blocks scattered by careless hands. From the mountain trail, Ezekiel could see the main street bisecting the settlement, lined with the false fronts and weathered boards that marked every frontier town. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and even at this distance, he could hear the sounds that had become foreign to his ears, hammering, shouting, the creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle. The town had grown since his last glimpse of it decades ago. What had once been little more than a trading post and a few scattered buildings now boasted a proper main street with boardwalks, a church steeple rising above the other structures, and the unmistakable bulk of a hotel. Progress had found its way into this remote valley, bringing with it all the complications that civilization carried in its wake. As he walked down the final switchbacks of the mountain trail, Ezekiel felt eyes upon him. Word traveled fast in small towns, and a stranger descending from the high country would be noticed, discussed, and judged before he reached the outskirts. He straightened his shoulders and gripped his walking stick firmer. Whatever came next, he would meet it with the dignity that the mountains had taught him. The first building he encountered was Murphy's Saloon, a two-story structure with a wide porch and windows that had actually been glazed with real glass, a luxury in these parts. The swinging doors stood open, releasing the mingled scents of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed men. A hand-painted sign advertised, "Cold beer, warm welcome fair games." It was behind this building, in the narrow alley where empty bottles and kitchen scraps accumulated, that Ezekiel first saw her. Clara lay curled against the back wall of the saloon, her form so small and still that for a moment he thought she might be dead. She wore a dress that had once been fine blue silk with tiny pearl buttons, but now hung torn and stained. Her dark hair spilled across her face, and her hands, clutched to her chest, were scratched and dirt-stained. Something stirred in Ezekiel's chest, a feeling he'd thought buried with Sarah all those years ago. Not love that was too much to hope for or fear, but recognition. This woman carried the same weight he knew, the same exhaustion that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one soul. He approached carefully, the way he'd learned to approach wounded animals in the wild. She stirred as his shadow fell across her, and when she looked up, her eyes held depths of weariness and pain that matched his own. Those eyes were green as mountain lakes, and they studied him with an intelligence that remained sharp despite her circumstances. She didn't speak, but neither did she cower. There was strength in her stillness, the kind of strength that comes from enduring what shouldn't be endured. "Ma'am," Ezekiel said quietly, removing his worn hat. His voice, unused for so long, came out rough as bark. "You hurt?" She shook her head slightly, but continued to watch him with those careful eyes. "You got somewhere to go?" This time she looked away, and he had his answer. The afternoon sun slanted through the alley, casting everything in golden light that softened the harsh edges of their circumstances. In that light, with dust motes dancing between them and the distant sounds of the town carrying on its business, Ezekiel Boone made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He'd spent 23 years learning that sometimes the hardest thing about being alone isn't the silence, it's the knowledge that no one would miss you if you disappeared. Looking at this woman, seeing his own isolation reflected in her careful distance, he understood that fate had brought them both to this alley for a reason. "My name's Ezekiel Boone," he said, settling his hat back on his graying head, "and I think we might be able to help each other." Clara's theatrical costume, once a vibrant blue that had caught stage lights and audience eyes, now hung on her frame like a reminder of dreams that had soured into nightmares. The silk, torn at the shoulder and stained with dust from the alley, still held traces of its former beauty, tiny pearl buttons that caught the afternoon light, delicate embroidery along the bodice that spoke of better days and distant stages. She studied this mountain man with eyes that had learned to read people quickly and accurately. 2 years of traveling with Hartwell's dramatic company had taught her that survival often depended on understanding a person's character in the first few moments of meeting them. This Ezekiel Boone carried himself differently than the men who usually found women in back alleys. His approach held respect, caution, and something else, a recognition that stirred something long dormant in her chest. "Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying traces of education and refinement that years of hardship couldn't quite erase. "Though, I suppose that name doesn't carry much weight anymore." Ezekiel settled himself against the opposite wall of the alley, careful to maintain distance that wouldn't seem threatening. His movements held the fluid economy of someone accustomed to living in spaces where careless motion could mean death. "Names have the weight we give them," he said. "What happened to yours?" The question was asked gently, without the prurient curiosity she'd grown accustomed to from townspeople who whispered about the fallen actress sleeping behind the saloon. There was something in his weathered face that invited honesty. "I traveled with a theatrical company," Clara said, smoothing the torn silk of her costume with hands that trembled slightly. "We performed Shakespeare, contemporary dramas, musical reviews. I played Juliet in Denver, Portia in Salt Lake City. For 2 years, I thought I'd found my calling. What changed?" Clara's laugh held no humor. Mr. Hartwell's interpretation of what an actress owed her manager grew beyond what any decent woman could accept. "When I refused his advances, he convinced the others that I was stealing from the company funds. They left me here 3 days ago with nothing but what I wore on stage." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. In the mountains, he'd seen the casual cruelty that stronger creatures inflicted on weaker ones, but there was something particularly ugly about humans who used their power to destroy rather than protect. "You got family somewhere?" "I was raised in an orphanage in Boston. No family, no connections, no place to return to." Clara met his eyes directly. "I understand the position I'm in, Mr. Boone. I know what options are typically offered to women in my circumstances. If you're here to make such an offer, you should know that I'd rather starve." "I'm not," Ezekiel said quietly. His respect for her dignity, even in these circumstances, showed in every line of his weathered face. "But I might have something different to propose." He told her then about the destroyed cabin, about his 23 years in the mountains, about the strange circumstances that had brought them both to this alley on this particular afternoon. As he spoke, Clara found herself studying not just his words, but the man himself, the careful way he chose his phrases, the respect he showed for her situation, the complete absence of the predatory calculation she'd learned to fear in men's eyes. "I need to start over," Ezekiel said. "Build a new life somewhere, somehow. You need safety, protection, a chance to rebuild your own life. There might be a way we could help each other." "What are you suggesting?" Ezekiel took a deep breath. "Marriage. A practical arrangement. Not—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Not romantic. A partnership. You'd have a name, protection, respectability. I'd have someone who understands that starting over takes courage and that some wounds take time to heal." Clara stared at him, searching his face for deception, for the catch that always came with offers that seemed too good to be true. "You don't know me. I could be everything they accuse me of. I could be a thief, a liar, worse." "Could be," Ezekiel agreed. "But you're not. 23 years of reading sign has taught me to recognize prey and predator, honest folk and deceivers. You're hurt, you're scared, and you're proud, but you're honest. And what do you get from this arrangement? Company," Ezekiel said simply. "Someone to talk to, who understands what it means to lose everything and have to build again. Someone who won't expect me to be anything other than what I am." The afternoon shadows lengthened as Clara considered his proposal. It was mad, impractical, and completely contrary to every sensible approach to marriage she'd ever been taught. It was also the first offer of genuine help she'd received since her world fell apart 3 days ago. "If I agreed," she said carefully, "what would be expected of me?" "Respect," Ezekiel said. "Honesty. Help in building whatever comes next for both of us. Nothing more, unless you chose to offer it. And if I wanted to leave, you could, anytime. I won't hold you against your will." Clara studied his face one more time, looking for the lie that would make this too good to be true. She found none. What she found instead was something she hadn't seen in a very long time, a man whose word could be trusted. "Mr. Boone," she said, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin with a dignity that her circumstances couldn't diminish, "I accept your proposal." Within an hour, they stood before Justice of the Peace Thomas Henderson in his cramped office above the general store. Henderson, a practical man who'd seen enough frontier hardship to understand unconventional solutions to difficult problems, asked no questions about the hasty marriage or the bride's theatrical costume. He simply performed the brief ceremony, accepted Ezekiel's gold nugget as payment, and wished them both good fortune. Mrs. Ezekiel Boone walked down Main Street beside her new husband as the sun set behind the mountains, drawing curious stares and whispered conversations from the townspeople. She held her head high, her torn costume somehow transformed into a badge of survival rather than shame. But as they passed Murphy's saloon, a man stepped out of the shadows near the hitching post. Jake Morrison was tall and broad, with the kind of face that promised violence and delivered on its promises. His eyes, small and dark, fixed on Ezekiel with predatory interest. "Well, well," Morrison said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Looks like our mountain hermit has come down to find himself a bride. Heard tell you've got some interesting claims up in them high peaks, Boone. Might be we should talk about that sometime." Ezekiel's grip tightened on his walking stick, but his voice remained level. "Don't believe we've been introduced. Jake Morrison, I make it my business to know about opportunities in this territory." Morrison's smile held no warmth. "Especially opportunities involving gold." The word gold seemed to hang in the evening air like smoke. Clara felt the shift in the attention around them, conversations pausing, eyes turning their direction, interest sharpening to something dangerous. "Come along, Clara," Ezekiel said quietly, taking her arm. "We should find some supper." As they walked away, Clara could feel Morrison's eyes following them. She'd learned to recognize dangerous men during her time with the theatrical company, and Jake Morrison was dangerous in ways that went far beyond simple violence. He was the kind of man who would take whatever he wanted and destroy anyone who stood in his way. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. "Trouble," Ezekiel replied. "The kind that follows rumors of easy money." Clara looked back once and saw Morrison still watching them, his expression calculating. She'd married this stranger to escape one kind of danger, but she was beginning to understand that she might have walked directly into another. The difference was that this time she wouldn't face it alone. The wedding ring Ezekiel fashioned from his own gold nugget was simple and rough, hammered into shape at the blacksmith's forge after their hasty ceremony. The metal held the warm color of mountain streams and sunset light, and as he slipped it onto Clara's finger by lamplight in their rented hotel room, it seemed to carry the weight of promises neither fully understood yet. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, Clara in the single wooden chair by the window, Ezekiel perched on the edge of the narrow bed, like two careful strangers trying to navigate the strange territory of sudden matrimony. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was profound, filled with all the things they didn't know about each other and weren't sure they should ask. "It's a good room," Clara said finally, looking around at the clean walls, the window with actual glass, the wash basin with a mirror above it. After 3 nights sleeping behind the saloon, the simple accommodations seemed luxurious. "Better than what I'm used to," Ezekiel replied. 23 years of sleeping on pine boughs and elk hide makes a man appreciate a real mattress. What will we do tomorrow? The question hung between them, practical and immediate. Neither had planned beyond the moment of marriage, beyond the desperate need to find solid ground in lives that had suddenly shifted beneath their feet. Find work, I suppose, Ezekiel said. I can hunt, trap, guide folks into the mountains. Not sure what call there is for that in town, but I'll learn. I can read and write well, keep accounts, teach children. Clara twisted the rough ring on her finger. Though I suspect my reputation may precede me. Then we'll make a new reputation, Ezekiel said with quiet determination. Together. The next morning brought their first test. Clara woke to find Ezekiel already dressed and sitting by the window, watching the street below with the alert stillness of someone accustomed to reading danger in the landscape. His walking stick leaned against the wall beside him, and she noticed how his hand never strayed far from it. What is it? She asked, recognizing the tension in his posture. That Morrison fellow. He's been out there since sunrise, watching folks come and go from the hotel. Clara joined him at the window, careful to stay back from the glass. Morrison stood across the street, leaning against the post outside the general store, with the casual posture of a man with nothing better to do. But his eyes never left the hotel entrance. What does he want? Information, Ezekiel said, about where I lived, up in the mountains, what I might have found there, whether it's worth the trouble of taking. Is it? Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, and Clara realized she'd asked something he wasn't sure he should answer, even to his wife. The thought struck her as both reasonable and profoundly sad. They were married, but they were still strangers. There's gold up there, he said finally. Not a fortune, but enough to interest men like Morrison, enough to make them think it might be worth killing for. The casual way he mentioned killing sent a chill down Clara's spine. In her theatrical world, violence had been confined to dramatic death scenes and carefully choreographed sword fights. The idea that real men might actually kill for gold seemed like something from the melodramas they'd performed, not real life. Have you killed? She asked quietly. Ezekiel looked at her with those steady grey eyes. When I had to. When there was no other choice. Would you again? To protect what's mine? Yes. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of the man she'd married. He wasn't just a gentle hermit seeking companionship. He was someone who'd survived alone in unforgiving country for over 2 decades. Which meant he possessed capabilities that polite society rarely required or acknowledged. What's mine? She repeated. Am I included in that? You're my wife, Ezekiel said simply. That means something to me, even if this started as a practical arrangement. They made their way downstairs to the hotel dining room, where Mrs. Patterson, the proprietress, served them breakfast with the kind of studied politeness that indicated she'd heard all the gossip but was too well-bred to comment directly. Other guests glanced their way with curiosity. The mountain hermit and his actress bride were clearly the most interesting thing to happen in Willow Flats in some time. After breakfast, they walked Main Street together, Clara holding Ezekiel's arm, as propriety demanded, but also drawing strength from his solid presence. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain air that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch. They visited the general store, where Ezekiel purchased basic necessities with careful attention to their limited funds. Clara watched him count out coins with the precision of someone who knew the value of every cent, who understood that money spent foolishly could mean the difference between comfort and hardship. We'll need to find more permanent lodging, he said as they left the store. The hotel's fine for now, but we can't afford it long term. There's a boarding house on Elm Street, Clara suggested. Mrs. Morrison takes in respectable married couples. Morrison? Ezekiel stopped walking. Different Morrison. Sarah Morrison, a widow who runs a clean establishment. I heard some of the theatre company ladies talking about it. Clara paused, though she might not welcome the former actress who caused such a stir. We'll ask, Ezekiel said firmly. Worst she can do is say no. They were interrupted by the approach of a young man in a deputy's badge, clean-shaven and earnest-looking. "Mr. Boone, I'm Deputy Collins. Sheriff wants to have a word with you, if you don't mind." Clara felt Ezekiel tense beside her, though his expression remained calm. "About what?" "Nothing serious," Collins assured them. "Just likes to meet newcomers, especially folks planning to settle in town." The sheriff's office was a small building with barred windows and the lingering scent of old coffee and tobacco. Sheriff William Hayes was a man in his 50s, grey-bearded, and carrying the kind of authority that came from years of keeping peace in places where peace was always fragile. "Ezekiel Boone," Hayes said, rising from behind his desk. "Heard you came down from the high country. Been up there a long time, folks say." 23 years, Ezekiel confirmed. "That's a long time to be alone with your thoughts. What brought you down?" "Rockslide took my cabin. Time to start over." Hayes nodded, studying both of them with the careful attention of a man whose job required reading people accurately. "Heard you got married right quick." "That's your business, of course, but it's got people talking." "People always talk," Clara said, speaking up for the first time, "especially about things they don't understand." "True enough, ma'am." Hayes smiled slightly. "What I'm really here to discuss is Jake Morrison. He's been asking questions about you, Boone, about what you might have found up in those mountains." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that usually lead to trouble. Morrison's got a reputation in these parts. He's careful to stay just inside the law, but he's got a way of making life difficult for folks who don't cooperate with his business interests." Ezekiel and Clara exchanged glances. "What kind of business interests?" "Mining claims, mostly. He has a way of convincing folks to sell their claims for less than they're worth. Sometimes much less." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "I can't prove he's broken any laws, but I've buried 2 men in the past year who had disagreements with Morrison about mineral rights." "Are you warning us off?" Ezekiel asked. "I'm telling you to be careful. Morrison's got 3 men working for him, and they're not particular about methods. If you've got claims up in the mountains, you might want to think about filing the proper paperwork, making everything legal and official." "And if I don't have any claims?" Hayes studied him with knowing eyes. "Then you might want to think about getting some. Man's got a right to protect what's his, but the law works better when everything's documented proper." As they left the sheriff's office, Clara noticed Morrison standing across the street again, this time with 2 other men, hard-looking characters with the kind of faces that promised trouble. They made no effort to hide their interest in watching Ezekiel and Clara. "He's not going to leave us alone," Clara said quietly. "No," Ezekiel agreed. "He's not. What do we do?" Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm determination that Clara was learning to recognize as his response to threat. "We get legal, we get prepared, and we hope it's enough." That evening, in their hotel room, Clara watched Ezekiel clean and check a pistol she hadn't known he was carrying. The weapon was old but well maintained, and he handled it with the casual familiarity of long practice. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "Not long," Ezekiel replied. "Morrison's not patient, and rumors about mountain gold won't stay quiet. He'll make his move soon." Clara looked down at the rough wedding ring on her finger, at this symbol of a marriage born from desperation and necessity. In the space of 1 day, it had become something more, a bond that would be tested by violence and greed. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Ezekiel said, "but we'll face it together." The wanted poster was crumpled and stained with coffee rings when Clara found it tucked behind the hotel registry counter. She'd been helping Mrs. Patterson with the morning accounts, a small way to earn their keep while they searched for permanent lodging, when the yellowed paper caught her eye. The name at the top made her blood run cold. Jake Morrison, wanted for murder and robbery in Kansas Territory. The sketch was rough but recognizable, showing the same hard features and cold eyes she'd seen watching them from across the street. Below the drawing, The details painted a picture of a man who'd left a trail of violence across 3 territories. 2 counts of murder, multiple robberies, suspected involvement in claim jumping that had left entire families dead. Clara's hands trembled as she read the reward amount $500, enough money to transform a person's life in this harsh country. But it was the date that truly frightened her. The poster was only 6 months old, which meant Morrison's crimes were recent, his violence fresh and immediate. "Mrs. Patterson," Clara said carefully, "how long has Mr. Morrison been in Willow Flats?" The older woman looked up from her ledger, her face creased with concern. "About 8 months now. Came in claiming to be a mining consultant, looking for investment opportunities. Why do you ask, dear?" Clara folded the poster carefully and tucked it into her skirt pocket. Just curious about the local business community. But she wasn't curious, she was terrified. Morrison wasn't just a local, tough looking to muscle in on Ezekiel's mining claims. He was a killer who'd found a new hunting ground and was using the respectable facade of business to select his prey. She found Ezekiel behind the hotel, teaching himself to split kindling with a technique that conserved energy while producing clean, even cuts. His movements were precise and economical, the result of decades spent making every motion count. The repetitive work seemed to calm him, and Clara hated to disturb the first peace she'd seen in his face since their marriage. "Ezekiel," she said quietly, producing the wanted poster. "I found this." His hands stilled on the axe handle as he read, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. $500, he said finally. "That's more money than most folks see in 2 years. We have to tell Sheriff Hayes." "We will. But think about what this means, Clara. A man doesn't stay in one place for 8 months if he's running from the law. Morrison's got protection here, or he's confident nobody will recognize him. Either way, it makes him more dangerous, not less." That evening, they sat in their room as twilight painted the mountains, purple and gold. Clara had taken to mending her torn costume, not because she intended to perform again, but because the familiar motions of needle and thread soothed her nerves. Ezekiel sat by the window, ever watchful, his weathered hands working a piece of wood with his knife, another animal totem for his walking stick. "Tell me about your theater company," he said suddenly. "What was it like, traveling and performing?" Clara looked up from her sewing, surprised by the personal question. In the 3 days since their marriage, they'd focused on practical matters, lodging, money, the immediate threat of Morrison. They hadn't talked about the lives they'd left behind. "It was magical at first," she said, settling back in her chair. "I'd grown up in that orphanage, never knowing anything beyond grey walls and strict schedules. Then suddenly, I was in Denver, wearing silk costumes and speaking Shakespeare's words to audiences who hung on every gesture." She paused in her stitching, remembering. "I played Lady Macbeth in Colorado Springs, and there was this moment during the sleepwalking scene when the entire theater was so quiet you could hear people breathing. That's power, Ezekiel, to move people with nothing but words and emotion. What changed?" Clara's needle stilled. Mr. Hartwell, he was. Charming at first. Educated, well-traveled, full of stories about the great theaters back east. He made me believe I could be something special, someone important. Her voice grew bitter. Then he began to believe he owned me, along with the rest of the company property. "Did he hurt you?" He tried. "The night before they abandoned me here, he came to my hotel room with brandy and expectations. When I refused him, he became violent." Clara touched her throat unconsciously, remembering hands that had left bruises. "I fought him off, but it cost me everything I'd worked for." Ezekiel's knife had stopped moving against the wood, and his knuckles were white where he gripped it. "Where is he now?" "The company was heading to San Francisco, but Ezekiel, that life is over. I can't go back to it, even if I wanted to." "Maybe not that life," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean you have to give up everything you loved about it." "What do you mean?" You have a gift for moving people, for teaching and speaking. This town could use a school teacher, someone who can bring education and culture to the children here. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare, but it could be something. The idea struck Clara with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't considered how she might build a new life rather than simply endure one. Do you think they'd accept me? A former actress with a scandalous reputation? They'll accept my wife, Ezekiel said with quiet certainty, especially if she proves herself to be exactly what this town needs. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Ezekiel's hand moved immediately to his pistol as he motioned for Clara to step away from the entrance. "Who is it?" he called. "Deputy Collins, Mr. Boone. Need to speak with you." Ezekiel opened the door cautiously, keeping his body positioned to protect Clara. The young deputy looked nervous, glancing up and down the hallway before stepping inside. "Sheriff Hayes sent me," Collins said quietly. "There's been talk around town today about that Morrison fella asking questions about mining rights up in the high country. Specifically about your old territory, Mr. Boone." "What kind of questions?" "Legal questions about what happens to claims when a man abandons them, how long before they revert to open territory. He's been talking to the assay office, the land claims recorder, even the territorial representative." Clara felt her stomach tighten. Morrison wasn't just planning violence, he was building a legal case to justify it. "There's more," Collins continued, his voice dropping even lower. "He's been asking about you too, Mrs. Boone. About the theater company that left you here, about where they were headed." "Why would that matter to him?" Clara asked, though a cold dread was already forming in her chest. "Don't know, ma'am. But he seemed real interested in the details. Asked if anyone knew how to contact them, if they left any forwarding information." Ezekiel and Clara exchanged glances. There was only one reason Morrison would care about Clara's former life, and it had nothing to do with gold claims. "Deputy," Ezekiel said carefully, "did Sheriff Hayes have any advice for us?" "He said to tell you that sometimes a man's best protection is making sure he's got friends who know where he is and what he's doing. People who'd notice if something happened to him." After Collins left, Clara sat heavily on the bed, the wanted poster clutched in her hands. "He knows something about Hartwell's company, something that makes me valuable to him beyond just being your wife. Or someone's been in contact with him," Ezekiel said grimly. "Someone who knows you're here and wants you found." The possibility hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd assumed her troubles with the theater company ended when they abandoned her. But what if Hartwell hadn't been satisfied with simply discarding her? What if her refusal to submit to him had consequences she'd never imagined? "What do we do?" she whispered. Ezekiel moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. Morrison was there again, barely visible in the shadows between buildings, but unmistakably present. "We stop running," Ezekiel said finally. "We make our stand here, on ground we choose, with people we trust. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're fighting." "How?" "By asking the right questions of the right people, and by making sure Morrison knows we're not as defenseless as he thinks." That night, Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of the frontier town, settling into sleep, the distant piano from Murphy's saloon, the low voices of men walking home from late card games, the creak of wooden buildings adjusting to the cool mountain air. Beside her, Ezekiel's breathing was steady but not deep, the sleep of someone who'd learned to rest while remaining alert to danger. The rough gold ring on her finger caught the moonlight from the window, and Clara found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been a discarded woman with no prospects and no protection. Now she was married to a man who'd already proven he would face danger to defend her, who saw possibilities in her future that she'd never dared imagine. But she was also a target, caught between Morrison's greed and whatever vengeful plans Hartwell might harbor. The theater costume folded carefully in the corner seemed to mock her, a reminder of dreams that had turned to nightmares, of trust given to the wrong people. Tomorrow, she decided, she would stop being a victim. She would learn whatever skills this harsh country demanded, would prove herself worthy of the protection Ezekiel offered and the respect this town might eventually grant. She would become Mrs. Ezekiel Boone, in more than just name. Outside their window, a shadow moved across the street. Morrison was still out there, still watching, still planning, but he wasn't the only one planning anymore. Clara touched the folded wanted poster beside her pillow and smiled grimly in the darkness. $500 was a lot of money, enough to solve many of their immediate problems. And Jake Morrison had just made the mistake of underestimating the woman he thought was merely an abandoned actress. He was about to learn that some prey fought back. Ezekiel's hidden cache map was nothing more than scratches on birch bark, the kind of rough notation that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't learned to read the language of survival in unforgiving country. But to Clara, watching him sketch the familiar landmarks with careful precision, it represented something profound, the difference between dying and living, when civilization was 20 miles away and winter lasted 6 months. Every man who spends time in the wild learns to prepare for catastrophe, Ezekiel explained, his weathered finger tracing the crude lines that indicated ridges, streams, and hidden valleys. Food caches, tool stores, emergency shelters, places where you can survive if everything else goes wrong. They sat in the early morning light filtering through their hotel room window, the map spread between them on the small table. Clara had woken to find Ezekiel already dressed and working, his mind clearly turning over the problems that Morrison's presence created. This cache, he pointed to a mark near what appeared to be a split boulder, has enough supplies to last 2 people through a hard winter. Preserved meat, ammunition, blankets, tools. It's hidden where no casual prospector would find it. How far from town? 2 days hard riding if you know the trails. 4 or 5 if you don't. Ezekiel looked up at her with those steady grey eyes. I'm teaching you this because you need to know. If something happens to me, if Morrison makes his move and things go wrong, you need options. Clara studied the map, trying to memorize the landmarks. The idea of surviving alone in the mountain wilderness terrified her, but she was beginning to understand that fear wasn't an excuse for ignorance in this country. "Show me how to read this properly," she said. For the next hour, Ezekiel taught her the basics of wilderness navigation, how to identify ridgelines on a crude map, how to calculate distances using natural landmarks, how to find water by reading the lay of the land. His teaching was patient and thorough, the instruction of a man who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. "You're a good student," he said when she successfully identified the route to 2 different cache sites. "Quick to learn, careful with details. That'll serve you well." "I've had to learn quickly before," Clara replied. "The theater taught me that survival often depends on adapting to new situations faster than the audience expects. This is different. In the theater, mistakes mean embarrassment. Out there, mistakes mean dying." The gravity in his voice reminded Clara of how much she still didn't know about the man she'd married. His casual competence with survival skills spoke of experiences that went far beyond simply living alone in the mountains. "How did you learn all this?" she asked. "Before you came to Colorado, I mean." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, rolling the birchbark map carefully. "The war," he said finally. "Both sides used scouts who could live off the land, move without being detected, survive behind enemy lines. I was good at it. The Mexican War? That and after. There was fighting along the frontier that never made the newspapers. Apache raids, territorial disputes, the kind of conflicts where men disappeared and were never spoken of again." His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "I did things I'm not proud of, learned skills I'd rather not have needed." Clara reached across the table and touched his weathered hand. "But those skills have kept you alive. They might keep us both alive now." "Maybe, or maybe they've just given me the knowledge to see how much danger we're really in." Their conversation was interrupted by voices in the hallway, Mrs. Patterson speaking to someone in the low, urgent tones that meant trouble. Ezekiel moved immediately to the door, listening. "Mr. Boone?" Mrs. Patterson called softly. "There's a gentleman here to see you." Ezekiel opened the door to find a well-dressed stranger in the hallway, a man in his 40s, wearing a fine wool suit and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Behind him stood two of Morrison's men, their presence making it clear this wasn't a social call. "Mr. Boone," the stranger said with a slight bow, "my name is William Hartwell. I believe you're married to someone who once worked for me." Clara's blood turned to ice water. The nightmare she'd hoped was over had followed her to Willow Flats, and it was worse than she'd imagined. "Clara," Hartwell continued, his voice carrying the cultured tones she remembered too well. "I've come to discuss your breach of contract with the Hartwell Dramatic Company. There are legal matters to resolve and financial obligations to settle." Ezekiel stepped protectively in front of Clara, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. "My wife doesn't have any obligations to you." "Ah, but she does," Hartwell said with a cold smile. "She signed a 5-year exclusive contract with my company, agreeing to perform only for me and to repay all investments made in her training and costumes. When she abandoned the company, she broke that contract. The penalty is quite severe." "She didn't abandon anything," Ezekiel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You threw her out for refusing your advances." Hartwell's laugh was cultured and completely without humor. "My dear mountain man, I'm afraid you've been told a rather romanticized version of events. Clara was dismissed for theft and immoral conduct. The local authorities have been quite understanding about my need to recover stolen property and collect debts." Clara found her voice at last. "I never stole anything from you, and you know it. Don't you?" Hartwell produced a leather satchel from his coat. This contained several pieces of jewelry and costume pieces that belonged to the company, along with nearly $200 in cash. "It was found in your hotel room in Willow Flats after you disappeared." The lie was so smooth, so completely prepared, that Clara realized Hartwell had been planning this confrontation for weeks. He'd had time to prepare false evidence, to bribe the right officials, to construct a legal framework that would give him everything he wanted. "That's impossible," Clara said. "I never had any company property, and I certainly never had $200. "Nevertheless, the evidence exists," Hartwell said. "The local sheriff is quite concerned about harboring fugitives. I believe a proper search of your current accommodations would resolve any questions about your guilt." Ezekiel's hand had moved to rest on his pistol grip, and Clara could see the careful calculation in his eyes. He was measuring distances, counting opponents, calculating odds. "What do you want?" Ezekiel asked. "Justice," Hartwell replied. "Clara will return with me to face charges for her crimes. The stolen property will be recovered, and the matter will be resolved according to law. And if we refuse? Then I'll be forced to involve the territorial marshal. I understand there's already some question about your own legal status, Mr. Boone. Something about mining claims and possible conflicts with established interests." The threat was clear. Hartwell and Morrison were working together, combining their separate grievances into a coordinated attack that would destroy both Clara and Ezekiel. "I need time to consider your offer," Ezekiel said carefully. "Of course. 24 hours should be sufficient. I'll be staying at the hotel, and my associates will be keeping watch to ensure there are no misunderstandings about Clara's current status." After Hartwell and his escorts left, Clara collapsed into the chair by the window, her entire body shaking. The theatrical costume that had once represented her dreams now seemed like evidence of crimes she'd never committed, proof of a guilt that existed only in Hartwell's twisted imagination. "He planned this," she whispered. "Everything, Morrison. The timing, the legal framework. He's been planning it since the night I refused him." "How much of what he said was true?" Ezekiel asked gently. "None of it. I never signed an exclusive contract, never took anything that belonged to the company. But he has money, influence, and the kind of connections that can make lies look like truth." Ezekiel moved to the window, studying the street below. Morrison's men were already in position, watching every exit from the hotel. "Then we don't fight his lies with truth," Ezekiel said finally. "We fight them with something he doesn't expect." "What?" "We disappear. Tonight, before his 24 hours are up, we take what we can carry and head for the mountains." Clara looked at the rough map still lying on the table, at the careful marks indicating survival caches hidden in wilderness that seemed impossibly vast and dangerous. "Can we make it?" "Maybe," Ezekiel said. "If we're smart, if we're careful, and if we're willing to fight for what we've built together." Clara thought of the $500 reward for Morrison's capture, of the evidence that could destroy Hartwell's credibility if presented to the right authorities. Then she thought of the simple gold ring on her finger and the man who'd offered her protection when the world had abandoned her. "Then we disappear," she said, "but not to run away, to get strong enough to fight back." Clara's hidden knife was nothing remarkable, a small, sharp blade with a worn wooden handle that she'd carried since her first days with the theater company. She'd acquired it from a costume mistress in Denver who'd told her that a woman traveling alone needed more protection than stage makeup and pretty speeches could provide. Now, sitting in their hotel room as evening shadows gathered, Clara drew the knife from its hiding place, sewn into her skirt, and placed it on the table beside Ezekiel's map. "I'm not as helpless as Hartwell thinks," she said quietly. "I've had to defend myself before." Ezekiel examined the blade with the careful attention of someone who understood weapons. It was well maintained, despite its humble appearance, sharp enough to be dangerous in skilled hands. "Good," he said simply. "You'll need it where we're going." For the past hour, they'd been preparing for their escape from Willow Flats. Ezekiel had spent the afternoon discreetly purchasing supplies, ammunition, dried food, warm clothing, while Clara had used her theatrical skills to gather information. The combination of feminine curiosity and careful eavesdropping had revealed more about Hartwell's plans than any direct confrontation could have achieved. "Mrs. Patterson overheard Hartwell talking to Morrison," Clara reported. "They're planning to search our room tomorrow morning, and they expect to find the stolen property that will justify arresting me. But Hartwell made a mistake. He mentioned that the jewelry was hidden in a music box that belonged to the company." "What's significant about that?" "I never owned a music box, never even touched one during my time with the company. It's a detail that proves the evidence was planted, but only if someone knows to look for it." Ezekiel nodded approvingly. "You're learning to think like a survivor instead of a victim. That's good. You'll need that mindset in the mountains." Clara had been dreading the discussion of what their escape would actually entail. The cache map showed a journey through country that would test every skill she'd never learned, every instinct she'd never developed. But as Ezekiel began explaining their route, she realized he wasn't planning to simply hide in the wilderness. "We'll take the North Trail out of town," he said, tracing the path with his finger. "It's the hardest route, which means they won't expect it. Most folks heading into the high country take the easier southern pass, but that's where they'll look for us first." "How long before we reach the first cache?" 2 days, if the weather holds. 3 if we run into early snow." Ezekiel looked up at her with those steady gray eyes. "It won't be easy, Clara. Mountain travel is hard on people who grew up in cities. You'll be cold, tired, hungry, and scared. There'll be times when you want to give up. And if I do, then we both die," he said matter-of-factly, "because I won't leave you, and you can't survive alone up there." The brutal honesty of it struck Clara with unexpected force. This wasn't a romantic adventure where love conquered all obstacles. It was a desperate gamble where failure meant death for both of them. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. For the next 2 hours, Ezekiel taught her the basics of mountain survival: how to layer clothing for warmth without restricting movement, how to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, how to walk silently on different types of terrain, how to find shelter, start fires, and conserve energy during long, difficult travel. Clara absorbed the lessons with the focused intensity she'd once brought to memorizing scripts. The difference was that forgetting a line meant embarrassment. Forgetting these lessons could mean freezing to death in a Colorado blizzard. The most important thing, Ezekiel said as they prepared to leave, is understanding that the mountains don't care about your problems. They don't care if you're tired, scared, or hurt. They'll kill you just as easily as they'll shelter you, and the difference often comes down to making smart decisions when you're too exhausted to think clearly. How do you do that? Practice, repetition, learning to trust your training even when your mind is telling you to panic. He paused, studying her face in the lamplight, and having someone you trust to help make those decisions when you can't. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of their relationship. They'd married as strangers seeking mutual protection, but they were heading into circumstances that would require absolute trust. Life and death decisions made in moments of crisis, with no time for doubt or second-guessing. "I trust you," she said simply. "Good, because what we're about to do will test that trust in ways neither of us can predict." They left Willow Flats in the dark hours before dawn, when the guards Morrison had posted were least alert, and the town was deeply asleep. Clara wore the warmest clothes they'd been able to acquire, wool pants, leather boots, and a heavy coat that had once belonged to a prospector's widow. Her theatrical costume, carefully folded, was packed in her saddlebags as evidence of the lies they'd eventually expose. Ezekiel led them through back alleys and side streets, moving with the silent confidence of someone who'd learned to travel unseen. They reached the stable where he'd arranged to purchase 2 horses, sturdy mountain animals that might not be fast, but could handle the brutal terrain ahead. As they rode out of town, Clara looked back once at the hotel where they'd spent their first days as husband and wife. Morrison's men were already stirring, preparing for the day when they'd discover their quarry had vanished into the high country. "Any regrets?" Ezekiel asked quietly. Clara thought about the question seriously. 3 days ago, she'd been sleeping behind a saloon with no prospects and no protection. Now she was riding into some of the most dangerous country in the territory, pursued by men who wanted to destroy her. But she was no longer alone, no longer helpless, and no longer content to simply endure whatever fate others chose for her. "None," she said. "Whatever happens next, it's our choice." The trail climbed steadily as the sun rose behind them, illuminating peaks that seemed to stretch forever into the distance. The air grew thinner and colder, and Clara began to understand why Ezekiel had warned her about the challenges ahead. This wasn't the gentle countryside of her childhood stories. This was a landscape that demanded everything from those who dared to enter it. But as they climbed higher, leaving the complications of civilization behind, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since her first night on stage in Denver. She felt powerful, not because the journey would be easy, but because she was finally choosing her own path instead of simply reacting to the choices others made for her. Behind them, Willow Flats grew smaller and more distant. Ahead lay challenges that would test every lesson Ezekiel had taught her, every instinct she'd developed, every bit of courage she possessed. Clara touched the small knife hidden in her skirt and smiled grimly. Let Hartwell and Morrison follow them into the mountains. If they dared, they would discover that the helpless actress they'd planned to victimize no longer existed. In her place was a woman who'd learned to fight for what she wanted, guided by a man who understood that some things were worth any risk to protect. The mountains stretched ahead, vast and unforgiving, but they also promised something that civilization couldn't: the chance to become who you were meant to be, tested by hardship and proved by survival. Clara urged her horse forward, following Ezekiel up the narrow trail that would lead them either to freedom or to death. Either way, they would face it together, and they would face it on their own terms. The theater company contract was hidden in the false bottom of Clara's small traveling case, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. She'd forgotten about it completely until the second night in the mountains, when they made camp in a sheltered grove, and she was searching for her spare stockings. The yellowed paper crackled as she unfolded it by firelight, and Ezekiel looked up from cleaning his rifle when he heard her sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" he asked. Clara stared at the document, reading words she'd signed 2 years ago but had never fully understood. The contract wasn't the simple employment agreement Hartwell had described to the company. It was something far more sinister, written in legal language that masked its true purpose. "This isn't a performance contract," she said slowly. "It's an indenture agreement." Ezekiel moved closer, studying the paper over her shoulder. His frontier education didn't include legal training, but he'd seen enough documents in his time to recognize the difference between fair dealing and exploitation. "What does that mean?" "It means I wasn't employed by the theater company. I was owned by them." "Look here." Clara pointed to a clause buried in the middle of the dense text. "I agreed to perform exclusively for the company for 5 years, with all earnings to be applied against the debt for my training, costumes, and room and board. But the debt calculation is entirely at Hartwell's discretion." Meaning he could keep me bound to the company forever by simply claiming I owed more than I earned, and this clause here, she indicated another section. "If I tried to leave before the debt was satisfied, I would be pursued as a fugitive from lawful custody and returned to complete my service." Ezekiel's expression grew darker as he understood the implications. Slavery, dressed up in legal language, but slavery all the same. "Worse than that." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at this final clause." Ezekiel read aloud. "In the event of marriage or other change in status that would interfere with performance obligations, the contract holder maintains the right to collect the full debt immediately or to pursue recovery of the contracted individual through all legal means." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from their campfire. Clara hadn't escaped from an abusive employer. She'd fled from a man who believed he legally owned her and who had every intention of recovering his property. "How many women signed contracts like this?" Ezekiel asked. "All of us. Every actress, every singer, every woman who worked for the company." "Hartwell made it sound like protection," he said. "It guaranteed us steady work and prevented other companies from stealing us away." Clara laughed bitterly. "We thought we were joining a theatrical family. We didn't realize we were signing ourselves into bondage." "And the other women? What happened to them?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, remembering conversations that had seemed innocent at the time, but now took on ominous meaning. "Some disappeared between cities. Hartwell always said they'd found better opportunities, or gotten married, or decided to return home. But now, I wonder if they tried to leave and were dragged back, or killed." The possibility hit Clara like a physical blow. She thought of young Mary Sullivan, who'd talked about escaping to California, and pretty Elizabeth Chen, who'd mentioned a sweetheart in San Francisco. Both had vanished between performances, their belongings cleared out, and their names never mentioned again. "He's not just pursuing me for revenge," Clara realized. "He's pursuing me because I'm valuable property that tried to run away, and now that I'm married, he can claim my husband as a co-conspirator in theft." Ezekiel stared into the fire, his weathered face reflecting the gravity of their situation. "This changes everything. We're not just running from a spurned man seeking revenge, we're running from someone with legal documents that give him the right to pursue us anywhere in the territory. The marriage doesn't protect me? Not if he can prove the contract supersedes it. And with Morrison's connections, he might be able to buy the kind of legal support that would make his case stick in territorial court." Clara folded the contract carefully, her hands shaking. She'd thought marriage to Ezekiel had given her freedom, but instead it had only painted a target on both of them. Her attempt to escape bondage had condemned the man who tried to help her. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Tonight, while you're sleeping. Head west toward California and hope they follow me instead of staying to torment you." "No," Ezekiel's voice carried absolute finality. "We made vows, Clara. Maybe they started as practical arrangements, but they've become something more. I won't abandon you to face this alone." Even though I've destroyed your life? Even though you could have lived peacefully in the mountains if you'd never met me?" Ezekiel looked at her across the firelight, and Clara saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It wasn't just determination or duty, it was the beginning of something deeper, something that might someday grow into love. "My life was already destroyed," he said. "I was just too stubborn to admit it. 23 years of hiding in the mountains because I couldn't face the pain of losing everything I cared about. You didn't destroy my life, Clara. You gave me a reason to build a new one. But Hartwell can go to hell." Ezekiel's voice carried the kind of controlled anger that Clara was learning to recognize as truly dangerous. "I've spent too many years running from fights that mattered. I won't run from this one. What can we do? He has the law on his side, money to buy support, and men willing to kill for him." Ezekiel was quiet for several minutes, staring into the flames as if seeking answers in their dancing light. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd made a decision. "We fight back, but not the way he expects." "What do you mean?" "Hartwell's strength comes from operating within the system, using legal documents, buying officials, making his crimes look respectable. But out here, in the mountains, those advantages don't matter. Out here, survival depends on different skills." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're talking about killing him." "I'm talking about protecting my wife from a man who believes he owns her. If that leads to killing, then so be it." The finality in his voice told Clara that this wasn't bluster or empty threat. It was a promise. Ezekiel Boone had decided that some things were worth killing for, and she was one of them. "There's something else," Clara said, producing another paper from her case. "I found this with the contract." The second document was a list of names women who'd worked for the company over the past 5 years, with notations beside each name. Some were marked completed service, others reassigned, and a disturbing number were marked defaulted. Elizabeth Chen defaulted, Mary Sullivan defaulted, Sarah Martinez defaulted. Clara's voice grew quieter as she read. "Ezekiel, I think these women didn't disappear. I think they were killed for trying to escape." "How many?" 14 women over 5 years, all marked as defaulted. Clara looked up at him with horror in her green eyes. "I'm not the first woman to run from Hartwell's company. I'm just the first one who survived long enough to find protection." Ezekiel reached across the fire and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her cold skin. "Then we make sure you're also the last one he ever pursues." "How?" "By making him pay for every crime he's committed, not just against you, but against all of them." Ezekiel's expression was grim but determined. "We're going to destroy William Hartwell, Clara, completely and permanently. The law won't help those dead women, but justice might." Clara stared into the fire, thinking about Elizabeth's bright laughter and Mary's dreams of California, thinking about 14 women who'd tried to escape and paid with their lives, thinking about the contract that had made her a slave without her knowledge, and the man who'd used legal language to hide his crimes. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Be strong, be smart, and be ready to fight for more than just our own lives." The wind picked up, sending sparks from their fire dancing into the dark mountain sky. Somewhere behind them, Hartwell and Morrison were planning their pursuit, confident that they were hunting a frightened woman and an aging hermit. They were about to discover they'd been wrong about both. The military compass was brass and silver, worn smooth by decades of use and carefully maintained despite its age. Ezekiel had carried it through battles that never made the history books, across territories that existed only on government maps, marked Indian country and unsurveyed. When Clara found it wrapped in oiled leather at the bottom of his pack, she understood that her husband possessed secrets as carefully guarded as her own. "You were more than just a scout," she said, holding the compass up to catch the morning light. The inscription on the back read, "Captain E. Boone, 3rd Colorado Volunteers, Shiloh 1862. Ezekiel looked up from where he was studying their back trail, checking for signs of pursuit. 3 days in the mountains had taught Clara to read the subtle signs of tension in his weathered face, and she could see that he'd been expecting this conversation. "I was a lot of things during the war," he said quietly. "Most of them I'd rather forget." "Captain Boone," Clara repeated. "Not just a scout, an officer, someone who led men into battle. Someone who got men killed." The pain in his voice was old but still sharp. "Someone who followed orders that shouldn't have been given and made decisions that still wake me up at night." Clara set the compass down carefully between them. They'd made camp in a sheltered hollow near the tree line, hidden from casual observation but positioned to watch the approaches from below. Ezekiel had chosen the spot with the kind of tactical thinking that spoke of military training far beyond basic scouting. "Tell me," she said simply. For a long moment, Ezekiel was silent, his grey eyes focused on distant peaks that held memories too painful to examine directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "I led a company of volunteers in the early years of the war, men from Colorado Territory who believed they were fighting for union and freedom. Good men, most of them. Farmers, miners, shopkeepers who'd never seen real violence before they followed me into hell. What happened? We were sent to pacify Indian territories, to clear the way for railroad development and mining claims. The government called it securing the frontier, but it was genocide dressed up in military language." Ezekiel's hands clenched into fists. "We were ordered to attack villages that had nothing to do with any war women, children, elders who'd never raised a hand against white settlers." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Did you?" "For too long, yes. I told myself I was following orders, protecting my men, serving a greater cause. But the truth was simpler. I was a coward who couldn't face the consequences of refusing illegal commands." "What changed?" "Sand Creek," Ezekiel said, and his voice carried such pain that Clara instinctively reached for his hand. "November 1864. Colonel Chivington ordered us to attack a peaceful Cheyenne village under a flag of truce. 700 soldiers against maybe 200 natives, most of them women and children." Clara waited, understanding that this was a story that had to be told completely or not at all. "I refused the order, drew my pistol on Chivington himself, and told my men we were withdrawing. Half of them followed me, the half that still had souls left to save. The other half stayed and participated in the massacre." "What happened to you?" "Court-martial, stripped of rank. Officially, I was discharged for insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer. Unofficially, I was marked as a traitor by men who believed that following illegal orders was patriotism." Clara studied the compass again, understanding now why Ezekiel had carried it through 23 years of mountain exile. It wasn't just a navigation tool, it was a reminder of the moment when he'd chosen conscience over career, justice over convenience. "The men who followed you out, what happened to them?" "Some were killed by Chivington's supporters, others disappeared into the territories. A few made it home to face the shame of being branded as deserters." Ezekiel's voice grew quieter. "I led them into disgrace, Clara. Good men who trusted me, and I destroyed their lives by asking them to choose between duty and decency. You saved their souls, maybe, but I couldn't save their reputations, their families, their futures. That's the burden of command. You're responsible not just for the decisions you make, but for all the consequences that follow." Clara began to understand why Ezekiel had retreated to the mountains, why 23 years of solitude had seemed preferable to facing the complexities of human society. He'd learned that doing the right thing could destroy everything you cared about, and that knowledge had made him cautious about caring for anything again. "Is that why you hesitated to help me?" she asked. "Because you were afraid of the consequences?" "No," Ezekiel said, meeting her eyes directly. "I hesitated because I was afraid I'd fail you the way I failed my men, that my protection would bring you more harm than safety. And now? Now I understand that some fights choose you, whether you're ready or not. Hartwell and Morrison aren't going to stop because we run far enough or hide well enough. They're going to keep coming until someone stops them permanently. Clara felt something shift in the air between them, a crystallization of purpose that had been building since they'd fled Willow Flats. This was no longer about escape, it was about taking a stand. "What's the plan?" Ezekiel pulled out a crude map he'd been working on, marking the positions and movements of their pursuers based on signs he'd read in their back trail. "They're following us, but they're not mountain men. Morrison knows prospecting, but he doesn't know wilderness survival. Hartwell's completely out of his element. They're making mistakes, traveling too fast, leaving obvious sign, burning fires too large." "How many men?" "6, maybe 7. Morrison, Hartwell, and at least 4 others. Enough to be dangerous in a straight fight, but too many to move quietly through country like this." Clara studied the map, applying the navigation lessons Ezekiel had taught her. "They're pushing hard to catch us before we reach the high country. Because they know that once we get into the really rough terrain, their numbers won't matter. Up there, it's individual skill that counts, not how many guns you can bring. So we lead them higher? We lead them into a trap." Ezekiel's finger traced a route that wound through increasingly difficult terrain toward a narrow canyon marked with careful detail. "This is Dead Man's Gap, a box canyon with only one way in or out. The walls are too steep to climb, the passage too narrow for horses. If we can get them inside, we can pick them off one by one, or force them to surrender and face trial for their crimes." Clara looked at him with surprise. "You'd give them that choice?" "I'm not a killer, Clara. I never was, even during the war. I'm a soldier who understands that sometimes violence is the only language that evil men understand. But I'd rather see justice than revenge. Even after what they've done, even knowing about those 14 women?" Ezekiel's expression hardened, especially because of those women. "They deserve justice, not just vengeance. If we can capture Hartwell alive, we can force him to reveal where the bodies are buried, give those families closure. And if he won't surrender, then we do what's necessary to protect ourselves and prevent him from hurting anyone else." Clara felt the weight of the small knife hidden in her skirt, thinking about the skills she'd need to survive the confrontation ahead. 3 days of mountain travel had already changed her. Her hands were harder, her reflexes sharper, her endurance greater than she'd thought possible. But what they were planning would test more than physical capabilities. "Teach me to shoot," she said. "Clara, you said yourself that we're outnumbered. If this goes wrong, if you're injured or killed, I need to be able to defend myself." She met his gaze steadily. "And if we capture them, someone needs to guard the prisoners while the other person goes for help." Ezekiel considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, but understand shooting at targets is different from shooting at people. The moment you point a gun at another human being, everything changes." "I understand." "No, you don't. Not yet. But you will." They spent the afternoon on weapons training, Clara learning to handle Ezekiel's spare pistol with the same focused intensity she'd once brought to memorizing scripts. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, the recoil more jarring, the responsibility more sobering. "Remember," Ezekiel said as she practiced loading and reloading, "a gun is only useful if you're prepared to use it. If you draw that weapon, it means you've decided that killing is preferable to whatever alternative you're facing. Have you made that decision?" "About Hartwell and Morrison?" "Yes." "About their men?" Ezekiel paused. "That depends on the choices they make when the moment comes." As evening approached, they broke camp and began the final phase of their journey toward Dead Man's Gap. Behind them, their pursuers were pushing hard through country that grew more treacherous with every mile. Ahead lay the confrontation that would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of everyone who'd ever fallen victim to men like Hartwell and Morrison. Clara rode beside her husband through the gathering darkness, the compass secured in her pack and the pistol holstered at her side. 3 days ago, she'd been a frightened woman, fleeing from dangers she didn't understand. Now she was a partner in a plan that would either bring justice to those who deserved it or get them both killed in the attempt. The difference was that now she was choosing her fate instead of simply enduring it. Whatever came next, she would face it as Mrs. Ezekiel Boone, not the victim she'd once been, but the woman she'd decided to become. The mountains stretched ahead, dark and unforgiving under a sky brilliant with stars. Somewhere in that darkness, evil men were pursuing them with greed and violence in their hearts. They were about to discover that some prey had learned to hunt back. The general store's bell sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness of Dead Man's Gap, its iron form barely visible against the canyon walls that rose like cathedral spires on either side of the narrow passage. Ezekiel had positioned it carefully during the night, rigging a tripwire across the canyon entrance that would ring a clear warning when their pursuers finally arrived. The sound would carry perfectly in the confined space, alerting every living thing for miles around that the trap had been sprung. Clara crouched behind a boulder formation 30 yards from the canyon mouth, her borrowed pistol heavy in her hands and her heart hammering against her ribs. The past hour had been spent in final preparations, checking weapons, reviewing signals, making peace with the possibility that neither of them would survive the next few hours. "Remember," Ezekiel had whispered as they took their positions, "the first shot is the most important. After that, everything becomes chaos. Stay calm, stay hidden, and don't expose yourself trying to be heroic." Now, as the eastern sky began to pale with approaching dawn, Clara could hear the distant sound of horses picking their way carefully up the treacherous trail that led to the canyon. Hartwell and Morrison had pushed their men hard through the night, driven by the certainty that their quarry was finally trapped. The bell rang once, sharp and clear in the mountain air. Clara held her breath as the first rider appeared at the canyon mouth, one of Morrison's men, a lean character with the predatory caution of someone who'd survived too many violent encounters. He paused at the entrance, studying the narrow passage with obvious suspicion. "Don't like it, Mr. Morrison," the man called back to the others. "This here's a box canyon, only one way out." "That's exactly why they chose it," Morrison's voice replied from further down the trail. "They're hoping we'll be too scared to follow. Keep moving, Jenkins." The first rider urged his horse forward, and Clara watched as 5 more men followed him into the canyon. Morrison came third in line, his bulk unmistakable even in the dim morning light. Behind him rode Hartwell, elegant even in trail clothes, and 2 more hired guns who scanned the canyon walls with professional wariness. 7 men total, more than Ezekiel had estimated, but not enough to change their plan significantly. Clara forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting the urge to act before the signal came. The riders had progressed perhaps 50 yards into the canyon when Ezekiel's rifle cracked from his position high on the northern wall. The lead rider pitched from his saddle, clutching his shoulder and crying out in pain. His horse reared and bolted back toward the others, creating immediate confusion in the narrow space. "Ambush!" Morrison bellowed, drawing his pistol and scanning the canyon walls. "Take cover!" But there was precious little cover in the barren canyon floor, and Ezekiel had chosen his position well. His second shot took another of Morrison's men in the leg, sending him tumbling from his horse to sprawl in the dust. Clara waited for her signal, a specific whistle that would tell her to begin shooting. The plan called for Ezekiel to thin their numbers first, using his superior marksmanship and elevated position to maximum advantage. Only when the survivors tried to retreat would Clara reveal her position and cut off their escape. "There!" Hartwell pointed toward Ezekiel's muzzle flash. "On the north rim." Morrison's remaining men began returning fire, their bullets chipping stone and whining off the canyon walls. But they were shooting at shadows and echoes, while Ezekiel had a clear view of their positions. His third shot was aimed at Morrison himself, but the big man's horse chose that moment to rear, and the bullet passed harmlessly overhead. Morrison rolled from his saddle and pressed himself against the canyon wall, using a fallen boulder for partial protection. "Boone!" Morrison shouted. "We just want to talk. There's no need for killing." Ezekiel's answering shot sent rock chips flying inches from Morrison's head, making his opinion of negotiation quite clear. "He's got the high ground," one of Morrison's men said, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "We can't reach him from here." "Note, then we go back and find another way around," Hartwell said, his cultured voice tight with frustration and fear. "There is no other way around," Morrison replied grimly. "This is the only trail to the high country for 20 miles in either direction." "Then what do you suggest?" "We rush him, all at once, from different angles. He can't shoot all of us." Clara heard the desperation in Morrison's voice and knew that the moment for her part in the plan was approaching. The whistle came a few seconds later, 3 short, sharp notes that cut through the morning air like birdsong. She rose from behind her boulder and fired at the nearest horse, not aiming to kill but to create more chaos and prevent any organized retreat. The animal screamed and fell, trapping its rider beneath its bulk and blocking the narrow canyon passage. "Behind us!" one of Morrison's men shouted. "They got us surrounded." Now the canyon became a killing ground, with Clara's position preventing retreat, while Ezekiel's elevation made advance impossible. The surviving members of Morrison's gang found themselves caught in a crossfire with nowhere to run. "Throw down your weapons," Ezekiel called from above. "This is your only chance to surrender." Morrison's response was a wild shot in Clara's direction that went wide by several yards. She returned fire more carefully, her bullet striking the rock beside Morrison's head and showering him with stone fragments. "The woman's a better shot than you are, Morrison," Ezekiel taunted. Clara felt a surge of pride at the compliment, followed immediately by shock at how quickly she'd adapted to the deadly game they were playing. The terrified actress who'd cowered behind the saloon just days ago had been replaced by someone harder, more capable, more dangerous. "Hartwell," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "We know about the contracts. We know about the 14 women you murdered." "You know nothing," Hartwell replied, but his voice cracked with something that might have been fear. "Those women were thieves and whores. They got what they deserved." "Elizabeth Chen was 19 years old," Clara shouted back. "Mary Sullivan had a mother waiting for her in Boston. Sarah Martinez wanted to open a school for children." Each name she spoke seemed to hit Hartwell like a physical blow. Clara could see him crouched behind inadequate cover, his fine clothes torn and dusty, his carefully maintained facade crumbling under the weight of his crimes. "You're going to pay for every one of them," Clara continued. "Every woman you used, every life you destroyed, every dream you murdered for your profit." Hartwell's answering shot was pure rage, striking the boulder near Clara's position and sending her diving for deeper cover. But the wild shot revealed his location to Ezekiel, whose return fire was immediate and devastatingly accurate. Hartwell screamed as the bullet shattered his gun arm, sending his pistol spinning into the dust. He fell backward, clutching his wounded limb and cursing with language that would have shocked his theatrical audiences. "Surrender," Ezekiel called again. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." But Morrison wasn't finished. Clara watched in horror as he pulled a second pistol and began advancing on her position, using the canyon wall for partial cover and firing as he moved. The theater manager's whip had followed Clara across 3 territories and through 2 years of nightmares. Hartwell carried it as a symbol of his authority over the women in his company, claiming it was a stage prop from their production of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But Clara had seen him use it for real, had watched him leave welts on the backs of actresses who displeased him, had felt it sting herself the night she refused his advances. Now, as Morrison advanced on her position with deadly intent, she saw Hartwell struggling to reach the coiled leather weapon with his good arm. Even wounded and trapped, he was planning to reclaim his property, using the same tool that had terrorized so many women before her. "Clara!" Ezekiel's voice rang out from above. "Morrison's coming, get ready." But Clara was already moving, abandoning her position behind the boulder as Morrison's bullets chipped away at her cover. She rolled to new shelter just as the big man reached her former location, his face twisted with rage and determination. "There you are, you theatrical whore," Morrison snarled, swinging his pistol toward her new position. "Should have stayed in that alley where you belonged." Clara's return shot was instinctive, aimed more by desperation than skill. But desperation proved accurate. Her bullet took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild. He stumbled but didn't fall, cursing viciously as he fought to maintain his grip on his weapon. "Lucky shot," he gasped, blood spreading across his shirt. "Let's see you do it again." But before he could bring his gun to bear, Ezekiel's rifle spoke from the canyon rim. Morrison jerked once and toppled backward, a red stain blooming across his chest. He hit the ground hard and lay still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. "Morrison," one of his surviving men called out. "Boss, you all right?" There was no answer because Morrison was beyond answering anything. Clara stared at his motionless form, feeling a complex mixture of relief, revulsion, and grim satisfaction. The man who'd terrorized Willow Flats was dead, and she'd played a part in bringing him down. "Two left," Ezekiel called from above, not counting Hartwell. Clara could see the remaining gunmen conferring frantically behind their inadequate cover. One was wounded, clutching a blood-soaked arm, while the other kept glancing between Morrison's body and the canyon entrance that was still blocked by the fallen horse. "We surrender," the wounded man finally called out. "Don't shoot no more, we're done." "Throw out your weapons," Ezekiel commanded. "All of them. Then step into the open with your hands up." Two pistols and a rifle clattered onto the canyon floor as the survivors emerged from cover, their hands raised high and their faces pale with fear and defeat. "Please, mister," the wounded man said, looking up toward Ezekiel's position. "We was just hired help. We didn't know about no murdered women." "You knew Morrison was wanted for murder in Kansas," Clara called out, keeping her pistol trained on them. "You knew he was a killer when you took his money." "Yes, ma'am," the man admitted, "but a man's got to eat, and jobs are scarce in this territory." "Not an excuse for helping him terrorize innocent people," Ezekiel replied, beginning his careful descent from the canyon rim. "But it might be a reason to let you live, if you're willing to testify about what you've seen." Clara kept the two men covered while Ezekiel worked his way down the treacherous rock face. Her attention was focused so completely on the surrendered gunman that she almost missed Hartwell's movement. The theater manager had crawled through the dust and blood to reach his whip, and now he was struggling to his feet with the coiled leather in his good hand. His wounded arm hung useless at his side, but his eyes burned with the same obsessive rage that had driven him across 3 territories. "You destroyed everything," Hartwell screamed at Clara, raising the whip with shaking hands. 2 years of work, thousands of dollars invested, all ruined by your ungrateful defiance." The whip cracked through the air, its tip striking the ground inches from Clara's feet. She stepped backward, raising her pistol, but Hartwell was already drawing back for another strike. "You belong to me," he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "The contract was legal. You were my property." "I was never your property," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I was a human being who made the mistake of trusting you." "Human beings?" Hartwell laughed, a sound devoid of any sanity. "You're all just meat for the market. Pretty faces to sell tickets and warm beds when the curtain comes down." The whip cracked again, closer this time, the leather tip snapping past Clara's face with vicious accuracy. She could smell Hartwell's sweat and madness, could see the complete breakdown of whatever humanity he'd once possessed. "Elizabeth Chen died, calling for her mother," Clara said, steadying her aim. "Mary Sullivan died, praying for forgiveness. Sarah Martinez died, begging you to let her see her sister one more time. They died because they tried to steal from me." Hartwell raised the whip for what would be his final strike. "Just like you're trying to steal from me now." "No," Clara said quietly. "They died because they were inconvenient to a monster who thought human beings were merchandise. The whip descended in a vicious arc, aimed at Clara's face, but her finger was already tightening on the trigger. The pistol bucked in her hands, and Hartwell's scream was cut short as the bullet took him in the chest. He toppled backward, the whip falling from nerveless fingers to coil in the dust beside Morrison's body. For a moment, his eyes remained focused on Clara's face, filled with the same possessive rage that had driven him to murder 14 women. Then the light faded from those eyes, and William Hartwell spoke his last words. "You were mine." "No," Clara said to his corpse, "I never was." Ezekiel reached the canyon floor and moved quickly to check the bodies, ensuring that the threat was truly ended. The 2 surviving gunmen remained motionless with their hands raised, wise enough to understand that any sudden movement might earn them a place beside their former employers. "It's over," Ezekiel said, moving to Clara's side and gently taking the smoking pistol from her hands. "They're both dead." Clara stared down at Hartwell's body, feeling empty rather than triumphant. The monster who'd haunted her dreams was gone, but his death couldn't bring back the women he'd murdered or heal the scars he'd left on those who'd survived his cruelty. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we take these 2 back to Willow Flats to face trial for their part in Morrison's crimes," Ezekiel replied. "And we make sure the authorities know about Hartwell's victims so their families can finally have closure." Clara nodded, then looked around the canyon where so much blood had been spilled. "Will it be enough? Will justice for 2 dead men balance the scales for 14 murdered women?" "No," Ezekiel said honestly. "Nothing can balance those scales. But it's a start. And sometimes that's all we can do, make a start toward something better." Clara picked up Hartwell's whip and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of all the pain it had caused. Then she threw it into the canyon wall, where it struck with a satisfying crack and fell broken into the dust. "Yes," she said, "it's a start." The foundation stones for their new cabin were gifts from the people of Willow Flats, rough granite blocks, quarried by miners who'd worked Morrison's claims, sandstone cut by masons who'd seen their neighbors terrorized, river rock gathered by families who understood that sometimes justice required ordinary people to take extraordinary stands. Each stone carried the weight of gratitude and the promise of new beginnings. Clara knelt beside the foundation, placing the final cornerstone with her own hands, as the autumn sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in Dead Man's Gap, and the scars of that violent day had healed into something stronger than the wounds they'd replaced. "That's the last one," she said, brushing dust from her hands and stepping back to admire their work. The foundation was solid and true, large enough for a home that would shelter a family rather than a single hermit hiding from the world. Ezekiel straightened from where he'd been checking the cornerstone's placement, his weathered face showing satisfaction with their progress. "Good work. Come spring, we'll have the walls raised and the roof on. Be nice to sleep in our own beds again." They'd spent the winter in town, renting rooms above the general store, while Ezekiel worked as a hunting guide, and Clara established herself as Willow Flats' first schoolteacher. The work had been rewarding but temporary. Both of them understood that their future lay in the mountains, in the high country, where they'd learned to trust each other completely. "Mrs. Patterson says the hotel's been busier than ever," Clara observed, settling beside Ezekiel on a fallen log that would eventually become part of their front porch. "Word's getting out about Morrison's hidden gold caches. Prospectors are coming from as far away as Denver. Let them come. The mountains are big enough for everyone who's willing to work honestly for what they find." Ezekiel's voice carried the contentment of a man who'd made peace with his past and found purpose in his present. "Besides, more people means more children who'll need schooling." Clara smiled at the thought. Teaching the children of Willow Flats had awakened something in her that the theater never had, a sense of building something lasting, of shaping minds that would carry her influence into a future she might not live to see. The skills she'd learned on stage had proved invaluable in the classroom, but the satisfaction was deeper, more fundamental. "I received a letter from Elizabeth Chen's mother," Clara said quietly. "She thanked me for finally giving her daughter a proper burial and for making sure Hartwell paid for his crimes. That must have been difficult to read." "It was, but it was also healing." She said knowing the truth was better than wondering forever what had happened. Clara touched the simple gold band on her finger, remembering how it had looked when Ezekiel first fashioned it from mountain gold. 14 families finally have closure because we chose to fight back. And because you were brave enough to survive long enough to find help." Clara looked out across the valley where Willow Flats was settling into the peaceful rhythm of an autumn evening. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, children played in the streets without fear, and the sound of honest laughter drifted up from Murphy's saloon. It was a good place to build a life, especially when that life was shared with someone who understood the value of both solitude and companionship. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The complete isolation of your hermit years?" Ezekiel considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I miss the simplicity of it. When you're alone, the only person who can disappoint you is yourself. But I don't miss the emptiness. 23 years of talking only to myself and the wind that's not living. It's just existing. And this is living? This is living," he confirmed, reaching over to take her hand. "Building something together, protecting something that matters, planning for a future that includes more than just survival." Clara squeezed his calloused fingers, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A rockslide had destroyed Ezekiel's old life, forcing him down from the mountains into a world that had changed beyond recognition. Hartwell's cruelty had destroyed her illusions about trust and safety, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the determination to survive. But destruction had led to creation, loss had led to discovery, and 2 broken people had somehow managed to build something whole together. "I've been thinking about names," Clara said, her voice carrying a hint of mischief. "Names for what?" "For the children we'll teach in the school we're planning to build near the cabin, for the horses we'll raise in the pasture behind the house, for the stories we'll tell during the long winter evenings." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "For the babies we might have if we're blessed with them." Ezekiel's weathered face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "You want children? I want a future that includes everything we've been denied: safety, love, family, the chance to build something beautiful instead of just surviving something terrible." Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had protected her through their darkest hours. "But only with you, only if you want it too." "I want it," Ezekiel said simply. "All of it. The children, the school, the stories, the long winter evenings, the chance to be more than just 2 people hiding from their past." As the sun set behind the western peaks, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching their foundation stones catch the last light of day. Tomorrow would bring more work: timber to cut, plans to finalize, supplies to gather before winter closed the high passes. But tonight was for reflection, for gratitude, for the quiet satisfaction of survival transformed into hope. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, of autumn leaves and the promise of snow. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the gathering stars, and Ezekiel howled back, not the lonely call of a hermit seeking only echoes, but the joyful response of a man who'd found his pack at last. Clara laughed at the sound, thinking of how much they'd both changed since that first meeting in the alley behind Murphy's saloon. The frightened actress and the broken hermit were gone, replaced by a woman who could shoot straight when threatened, and a man who'd learned that some solitudes were worth breaking. "What's next?" she asked, as they prepared to walk back to town. "Next, we build," Ezekiel replied, helping her to her feet. "We build a home, a life, a legacy that honors everyone who didn't survive to see their own second chances. Together? Together." They walked down the mountain trail hand in hand, leaving their foundation stones to wait patiently for spring and the walls that would rise from them. Behind them, the high country settled into its ancient stillness, patient and eternal. Ahead lay the warm lights of Willow Flats, where a community had learned that sometimes strangers become family and outcasts become heroes. Clara looked back once at the stone foundation that would become their home, thinking of all the journeys that had led to this moment. The theater costume that had once represented dreams and nightmares was now packed away with other memories, replaced by practical clothes suited to a practical life. The walking stick that had guided Ezekiel through decades of solitude now rested beside their door, ready for new adventures shared rather than endured alone. They had traveled far from where they'd started, not just in miles, but in understanding, in courage, in the capacity to trust and be trusted. The mountains had tested them, the valley had welcomed them, and tomorrow would challenge them to build something lasting from the foundation they'd laid in blood, courage, and unexpected love. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything they'd never dared to hope for when they were still strangers, sharing desperate circumstances in a dusty alley behind a frontier saloon. Some stories end with dramatic flourishes and grand gestures. Others end quietly, with the simple satisfaction of work well done and love well earned. As Clara and Ezekiel walked home through the gathering darkness, they carried with them the certainty that theirs was the second kind of story, the kind that endures long after the telling is done, built on foundation stones strong enough to support whatever comes next.